Oh boy, remember that somehow brief stretch of almost a decade when people born after the Korean War were running things and it felt like we were going to turn the page on the supposed omni-importance of great moments in boomer history as super serious dramatic movie subjects? Well, tough. One way or another, the old white guys with very strong opinions on the Beatles versus Elvis are getting at least one more bite at the apple because there's still more of them than anyone else because that's what the boom and baby boom meant. And that means we're getting at least one more run of portentous awards bait about how the most important history in the history of history happened in the United States from the early 1960s to the mid-1970s and happened to white college guys trying not to go to Vietnam. Now that's not to say this kind of self-important myth-making can't also be good filmmaking. JFK is still a 100% riveting film from a technical and storytelling standpoint, even if its assertions on the subject and Oliver Stone's grasp of American history overall are only slightly less shaky than the average QAnon post, and All the President's Men holds up really well despite casting Redford and Hoffman for Woodward and Bernstein is about as generous as Chris Hemsworth playing me. But as much as it desperately wants to be, The Trial of the Chicago 7 is neither of those. Written and directed by Aaron Sorkin, well, I can pretty much stop right there, right? It's the West Wing guy doing this particular story at this particular moment in time, and you know what you're getting, especially since he started writing this back in 2006 as a Spielberg project, and then it bounced around between everyone from Paul Greengrass to Ben Stiller over the years since. So if you're expecting anything other than Sorkin and Full Tilt Schools in Session, you damn whippersnappers are gonna sit here and learn who and how important Tom Hayden was, goddammit mode. I don't know what to tell you. It plays and feels exactly like a bunch of very serious thoughts about his own thoroughly milquetoast middlebrow politics that Sorkin has been aching to have read into the record since the Bush administration, goosed up with some specifically highlighted bullet points for the Trump era because that appears to be what it pretty much is. The only unexpected part ends up being a half-baked attempt at Rashomon's story structure, whereby after the main players are introduced, the story leaps past the actual 1968 Democrat Convention riots to the trial itself in order to play at testimonial perspective gags as to the central question as to who, and if anyone, started the actual violence and in what context via flashbacks. An odd decision given that both the history is not exactly obscure on this point, and also Sorkin is neither the type of storyteller or telling the kind of story where nuance or mystery on this subject is ever going to be an issue. Beyond that, it's generic boomer history movie courtroom model. The music cues you expect, the cinematography you expect, soaring dramatic score and big speeches you expect, blocked and shot with militant competence, and a murderer's row of current year good acting talent, and also Eddie Redmayne, playing the actual Chicago 7 and recreations of scenes that sort of really happened, reframed in order to make whatever specific present-day relevant points the film is trying to get across at the time, and a handful of completely invented scenes designed to fill in the dramatic President Bartlett moments that the real trial didn't really have. That includes a climactic moment so cloying and so obviously impossible to have ever happened, even if you don't know the real history. I almost want to respect the brazenness of trying to get away with it in 2020. The closest it gets to an actual fresh take is when it tries with mixed success to center the way both the prosecution and defense teams tried to manipulate the state's inappropriate conflation of Black Panther leader Bobby Seale separate charges into the 7 alleged rioters trial, highlighting how much more real the stakes were for the Panthers and for black protesters in general than for the Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, Hayden, Yippies, and other white college kids, which actually is the more often overlooked and historically downplayed part of this trial and probably would have been a more compelling, illuminating perspective for the movie to just operate from. But here it ends up as little more than a subplot, albeit one that manages to generate one of the few surprisingly moving scenes in the film, and you can almost feel Sorkin knowing he's supposed to get this point, but not really getting it, especially given the way his script dials back on the amount of snarky, back-talking comedy hijinks the defendants like Rubin and Hoffman continuously pulled during the real trial itself, which would have further highlighted how life and death the politics of this era were for black activists, really more of a self-righteous game for a lot of the better-known, more lionized white guys, which also in turn kept giving me the sense that the film's tone itself was a mistake, at least after so many other movies telling these same kinds of stories from this era. The whole endeavor is at its strongest, and Sorkin clearly at his most personally invested and self-righteous, when it's focused on the thread of the actual trial being not just a miscarriage of justice, but a farce, with the trumped-up charges and Frank Langella turning in a terrific villain performance as a judge who's not only a bigot, but an ignorant, possibly senile, clearly incompetent buffoon. Gee, I wonder why judges with no business being on the bench and what to do about that would be so prominently featured on a super political movie's mind at this particular moment in such a subtle fashion. But he keeps diluting the sense of how farcical we're supposed to see this by making the atmosphere so stiff and staid otherwise. This whole and everyone clap to the movie approach, where people make symbolic gestures and meaningful nods, is just simply at odds with the fact that more than half of these people were basically just prank-pulling pre-digital shit posters doing shtick and calling it activism, so it ends up sanding the outrageousness down to little more than My Cousin Vinny routines in the court parts, and even then undercutting the supposed mischievousness of that with sentimentality. At a certain point I started wondering if it wouldn't be better to just have done the entire thing as a dark comedy with like the cast of Grown-Ups or something playing the 7. In the end, it's not even so much a bad movie as it is an overpoweringly average one that feels significantly worse worse by virtue of how little new ground is covered, how basic and surface level it plays everything, and how much opportunity it squanders to explore anything new in its material or the presentation thereof. Giving this one 4 out of 10, look, even if you do feel the need to watch this, you can get the same equivalent effect in a much shorter period of time by throwing on a classic rock station and like John Williams' The Patriot score at the same time and just reading the Wikipedia page about the actual trial. And it'll be over sooner too.